Welcome, everybody, to the Sports Experience Podcast. I am your co-host, Dom DiTolla, with my co-host,
Chris Quinn.
And today, we want to get into a little bit of a history lesson for all of you NFL fans here regarding probably one of the most modern institutions, but it's not so modern if you look at NFL history, free agency.
Yeah, how players essentially won their free agency.
Yeah.
It was like a struggle for them and their union, and we'll get into all of that because it's quite the owners really overstepped their bounds there.
They really overstepped their bounds, and unlike other sports, it was a very long and painful and non-money-making process for a lot of these players.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. A lot of the players who took the NFL to court actually didn't even receive damages because they weren't that great of players. They just saw this really horrible thing that the owners were doing, and they were like, well, let's try and take them to court.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
You got to use the legal route because the owners were quite powerful.
Oh,
and,
completely.
Basically treated these people like indentured servants pretty much until the last 20 to 25 years.
That's a nice way to say slaves, but yes.
Well, I mean, it's not as bad as college. They were at least receiving compensation, but it was nowhere near commensurate with the talent level or how they were making money for the franchise.
Yes, exactly. And that's what the players' union was, essentially tried to sue them a couple of times in the 80s and then was barred from suing them. And you know what? We're going to get all into it. Let's start with their original the original system that they had, where they copied the Major Baseball League.
I wanted to go back to 1920 when the NFL started. From 1920 to 1946, as I had stated before, players were treated like indentured servants in the respect that when a team drafted you or signed you, they basically owned your soul.
Yeah, for your entire career.
It's like that song, 16 Tons.
Ooh, yeah.
What do you get? No, but for the first basically 3 decades of NFL history, when a team drafted or signed you, you were tied to that franchise. The only way that you could ever get out, you couldn't sell your wares on the open market, you couldn't sell your talent to anybody else. You were with them forever, unless you were cut, unless you were traded, or you sat out and they just got rid of you.
Yeah, essentially retired and then came out of retirement. I saw somebody but that was so rare. Players weren't really doing that. Like, it wasn't like a thing where players were using this option. Like, if you weren't traded, you played for, whoever for your entire career.
Yeah, and sometimes that worked out for teams. Like, if you were really a smart franchise, kind of like the Bears at that time or Green Bay, if you were drafted by them and you stayed with them, and you were winning championships, and you could have an intact core of players for as long as they wanted to keep playing.
Yeah.
And it was a real advantage for all of the owners and all of the coaches because you had cohesion. But, of course, if you're a player and you're making peanuts and doing this for the love of the game, obviously that's nice, but you're not really able to make a living and you're spending your off seasons, driving trucks or professional wrestling or doing illegal activities.
Yeah, we've actually brought it up in previous podcasts where these guys were making less than they were at their day job, essentially playing football. So like when we say they're playing for the love of the game, like that is 100% true because in these off seasons, they essentially had to make money to cover playing football.
Yeah, because they were probably losing money, having to travel and, buy suits and things of that nature.
All the stuff that comes along with pro sports that wasn't afforded by the owners back then, which is absolutely crazy.
And the shitty part, and also the illegal part, if I wanted to point out, is this type of system in place, which obviously we could talk about MLB with Curt Flood and, challenging the reserve clause. The owners could collude.
Oh, 100%.
They could collude and be like, well, this guy's a star. We can just keep salaries down by just not paying them, an exorbitant amount of money.
Yep.
Now, mind you, there's no salary cap, but these players in the league wasn't making tons and tons of money. So they could just be like, no, I think we're pretty comfortable in not paying this guy what he's worth.
Yeah, you would think maybe it would have been in the advantage of the players, but it was in the advantage of the owners that they could keep like you were saying, keep everybody's salary down because of this kind of collusion. Like, now we're only going to pay that guy like $5,000 a year, and he's like the best player, essentially, instead of almost like a bidding war, which couldn't have happened.
No, it wouldn't have happened because the owners were like, oh, don't worry, we're not going to take this player from you. You can continue paying him
whatever.
Nothing.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah, peanuts, which is so sad, but it really is the way it was.
There was a good quote about George Halas, who owned the Bears, coached the Bears, basically until he died, essentially, front office guy. Mike Ditka, I believe, had referenced George Halas throws nickels around like manhole covers. Yeah. Because he was so cheap. And we brought it up in the old AFL episode when the Oilers tried to sign Ditka.
I wanted to bring up the AFL because there was so much collusion happening in there, they weren't even trying to hide it.
Yeah, the AFL, though, their collusion was more based on
survival.
Yeah. Like, it's not necessarily we're dicking over the players.
No.
We're paying the players a lot of money, but we're letting them go to the teams that they want to go to, so we have stars.
That was the first taste of free agency. It was like they gave the players like a little taste. They're like, this is what it could be. Yeah. The players are probably like, oh shit, that's a lot of money.
This is beautiful.
Yes.
Their collusion was more based on better intentions than dicking people over. It was more or less, how do we keep this weird thing going?
Yeah, it was funny shenanigans, not evil shenanigans.
I'm gonna pistol whip the next guy that says shenanigans.
What's that place you like to go to with all the funny shit on the walls?
The big mozzarella sticks. Shenanigans?
You guys talking about shenanigans? All right, we're tangenting off, but so the owners had all the control up until what, like 40s, 50s?
Yeah, and the one thing I wanted to describe about the history of the NFL at this time is a lot of these franchises were family owned.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And there are still franchises nowadays that are family owned, or even like the Packers where they have that weird stock sharing thing and technically no owner. But when these family-owned teams, and you see this now, especially with franchises like Chicago and Detroit and Arizona Cardinals, who were in Chicago, whatever, at that time, St. Louis, but they their revenue is not like a Jerry Jones. As far as Jerry Jones makes all his money in business investments from his oil, holdings and things of that nature. All of the money and profit that make these families rich is solely based in their team. So they're trying to make and maximize profit to an even greater extent because they have no outside sources of revenue.
Yeah, they're not investing outside revenue in. They're actually taking revenue out.
Exactly. Yeah. So their wealth ebbs and flows completely based on what their franchise does as opposed to anything really else in their family wealth. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But a big year was 1947.
Okay.
Was with the 1-year option rule that came into place, where the reserve clause was null and void 1 year after the contract expired, or before the contract expired in the option year. But the thing is the players really didn't use it at all because the owners could collude behind it. So even though that was like a little sliver of freedom, nobody really wanted to do that because if one team did it to another team, it would break the entire collusion thing, out there. And the players really didn't want to do it because they could get blackballed if they decided to go to another team. Like the team's like, oh my God, the guy's on the market, let's take him. And then the rest of the owners are like, yeah, go fuck yourself. You know?
And then he essentially would take a giant pay cut if he comes back. And there's all kinds of things that could happen to these players for stepping out into this option. You know?
Because there's the illusion of freedom.
And there's no safety net.
Exactly. Like you go out on that option rule and nobody wants you. It's like, oh boy.
Yeah. And I bet they would never come back to the NFL. That's the thing that was the collusion was so heavy that I bet if you were like, oh, we deserve this as players, we should do this more, being more outspoken, I bet the owners would be like, see ya.
And you'll see this throughout the history of the NFL during this era. The players are never as united as a sport like Major League Baseball to actually get shit done, which leads to their union being very, very pathetic in comparison as far as being united.
Well, very shaky and very ununited, if that makes any sense for a union.
Yeah.
It's very much not like like the MLB, who has the strongest union. They're not one voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're basically wildcatters and bird doggers as far as just like I need to get mine.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
And if someone's offering it, yeah, but I don't want to ruin myself more than anything. I'll just keep playing by the rules and hope something better comes my way, which is a horrible mindset if you're trying to set up a union.
Yes, and I feel like this is why the owners were so smart, was they put that in the players' heads that a union was not beneficial for them.
You're replaceable. Enjoy driving a beer truck 12 months out of the year instead of 6.
It's so sad, but it's true in football in this era. But
You think of professional athletes now as, a bunch of overpaid prima donnas, but when we're talking about this, when guys actually should have been paid, a
living wage.
Money. Yeah, I know. Dude. And you're getting the hell beat out of you. Nobody knows about CTE. Nobody knows about injuries. Sports medicine at that time was barbarism compared to what it is now as far as career or season-ending injuries.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really sad. The only time a player took advantage, and this is what kind of broke the whole thing, was in 1962 with the option rule. R.C. Owens, who was a fantastic wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. Like a really good way to describe him, if you've never heard of him, was, Larry Fitzgerald for the Cardinals?
Of course I do.
And Larry Fitzgerald, he's like a mix of Larry Fitzgerald in his prime with Randy Moss. Like he really invented the deep bomb, like the alley-oop, like throw it up in the end zone and
he'll go and catch it.
Yeah, exactly.
He'll outrun him or he'll outjump him.
Yeah, he was a terrific receiver. He signed with the Colts, and that really put a little bit of fear into the owners. But Pete Rozelle, who's the commissioner at the time, company man, always looking out for the owners. And because the commissioner of the NFL, if you don't know, and you can see by Roger Goodell's current incompetence, the owners have them by the balls because the owners pick who the commissioner is. And when you're making a cool, I don't know what Rozelle was making at the time, but Goodell's making tens of millions of dollars a year just basically to be the owner's bitch and do all of their bidding.
Well, almost like take all their heat.
Yeah, exactly. He's the face that everyone gets to shit on.
Yeah.
I mean, hell, I would love $30 million a year for people to yell at me and hate me.
I know. That's why when he gets up there and he's booed on the draft, he's just smiling like, I'm making about $50,000 right here today, right now.
Go back to your trailers, you worthless rubes.
Exactly. But that's why you can see the giant smile on his face and why the players have always kind of given the short end of the stick, because the owners have always had control. Control.
And even now they always have control, and
it's less than, but they still are But
yeah, that's a dream job. I mean, people hate me for free. I'd like $30 million for that. But
exactly. I come up on stage, they boo all the time. I want that money.
But in 1963, when they signed a new collective bargaining agreement, they called it the Rozelle Rule, where you can sign these guys, and this is kind of another form of collusion, but compensation has to come with it.
Yes.
And while that does exist today with the compensatory draft picks, and it's much more fair, Rozelle could decide in every situation what the compensation could be.
Which is crazy.
And it freaked the owners out, but it also helped them because they were like, oh no, we're not going to sign anybody. These idiots can go on the open market and we can just kind of laugh at them.
Yeah, which you see no real free agent or what we would call free agent signings back then because of this rule, because you really had no idea what the compensation was going to be.
Yeah, and it could come just, out of nowhere.
Yep.
And, Rozelle, who used to be part of the Rams organization, might favor the Los Angeles Rams. He might not. I mean, now it's much more based in reality as far as, okay, a guy leaves as a free agent. His contract, the amount of time that he plays,
and where he was drafted.
And where he's drafted will all go into a compensatory pick formula, which is kind of weird, but at least it makes more sense.
It makes more, yes. Then Rozelle be just like, well, I'm going to decide 2 draft picks, and it's just like, it makes more sense because it's more formulated. So if people go out to pick up these free agents, they know what they're going to have to pay.
Yeah, and it all factors in too with how many other free agents you sign, how much money you're dedicating to it. And I'll get into this. I'll do it right now. In the mid 90s, the Steelers lost a lot of free agents because as a family-owned team with a eventual salary cap, they let a lot of their best players go because they just could not afford them. However, when the compensatory pick formula came out, I believe in 98, 98-ish, they were able to just load up on third and fourth round draft picks and get eventual Hall of Famers and eventual All-Pros like Hines Ward and Joey Porter and Aaron Smith, really build the backbone of 2 Super Bowl winning teams.
Yeah.
But the compensatory formula is nothing to do with the Rozelle Rule. That's just a Wild West thing, him going, well, this guy's good here. You got to give him 2 first-round picks.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They're almost connected in the sense that it's compensation for players, but if you look at them, they're just 2 completely different aspects of the way, compensation works.
Yes, and by 1976, John Mackey, the late John Mackey, NFL Hall of Fame tight end, I think he was already retired by this point. He brought a lawsuit against the NFL arguing that it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act.
And this is where we start seeing a bunch of lawsuits stack up against the NFL, and the NFL just keeps winning them.
The NFL just completely the only person that the NFL can't win against is Al Davis.
Oh yeah, it's so weird.
Al Davis he put the fear of God into the NFL. I just wish he put the fear of God into the NFL over free agency. But
that was another team that lost a bunch of great players in that free agent scramble. But we'll talk about it.
But what they decided in this case was it deters clubs from spending money and deters players from seeking proper compensation. It proved the owners did collude and try and screw over all of these players, and it violates interstate commerce, which is part of our Constitution. So with all of that said, you're kind of seeing the NFL turn a corner, but you're kind of not, because the owners are kind of all in the same boat.
Yeah, it's hard to disrupt this collusion, especially when they're all guilty of it.
And what it leads to, interestingly enough, though, is still at this time, and I had brought it up earlier, really up until the early 80s, you saw teams, particularly dominant ones. Miami was a good example in the 70s, and the Steelers were really a good example in the 70s, where in 1979, the Steelers' entire roster, when they had their last Super Bowl of that era, all of those players on that roster, none of them played for another organization.
Yeah, they only played for the Steelers. They came up.
They were all
full
drafted,
careers,
or signed as undrafted free agents,
exactly,
and just stayed because there was no, way to get out of it.
No, that wasn't an option. That's what. When people look at like the way the NBA is now, and the players pretty much choose which teams they go and play for, and players choose which players they play with. Like it was the complete opposite in the NFL then, where literally movement never happened.
No, like if guys are changing teams, like the Raiders are a good example. If guys are changing teams, the Raiders would go after players who fell out of favor somewhere, who were cut, or they would try and trade for them to resurrect their career. It's not like they said, oh, we like this guy, we're just going to sign him to a fancy new contract.
Yeah, it's not like Dan Marino's on his last year, and they're like, hey, we'll give you this option over here. Like that never. You would have to be out of favor with your team for another team to come in.
The Raiders were like, this guy tried to bite another man's face off and got cut. Sold,
yes.
But what it did, this court case did, was kind of important because it's a very slow path to freedom for these players. A very slow path. Hey, everybody. Just want to take a quick break to let you know that our Sports Experience podcast is brought to you by Engle Studio here, and they're here in Tucson for all your recording needs. In 1977, a rule was created called the right of first refusal, which is, you could sign a guy who had an expiring contract, but the team that he was with could automatically match it. Mm-hmm. right of first refusal and be like, oh no. And it deterred clubs from doing that because, yeah, we want this guy and we want to pay him, but we don't want to fall out of favor with all the owners, because that is the one thing I've noticed through this entire free agency fight, and is the owners had solidarity.
Yes.
The players didn't. The owners had all the solidarity to go, nope, let's just keep going in the black every year and building this sport with our TV money and treating these guys like shit, and I don't know what concussions are.
Yeah, no, it's very much... It's a sad thing, and like you said, it was a very slow process throughout the 80s, and we're going to get into it right now, when the owners completely overstepped what they were doing. So the owners were like, well, let's see how far we can take it. Yeah. Because, and I think here, let me look at my thing. I think in 85, they decertified the union.
Yeah, and
so
that was a big one.
That was a big one because they had sued the NFL so much that I think it was they were unable to sue them for a period of 3 years under the antitrust laws, because you can only sue somebody, an organization, so much. So
exactly,
that's when they decided to decertify their union and let players individually sue the NFL, which is when I feel like the NFL was like, oh shit, we're gonna really start paying out.
Well, the big thing before 85. Two things, or one very important thing happened was the USFL comes into being in 1983.
Yep.
And what the USFL does, much like the old AFL, although they were really, the owners were good, most of them. But the guy at the top, Donald Trump, I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. I think he held some like high political office recently.
I'm unaware, but I'll look him up after.
His wonderful business incompetence really destroyed what could have been a league, which would have been like more like the ABA, where you would have had a few teams joining. But the genius of the USFL was, they got rid of the 4 years in college rule.
Yep.
If you were an underclassman, you could go and play. Herschel Walker is a great example of that. But they were paying guys what they were worth, and it put the fear of God into the NFL, and players could move around and change teams and things of that nature.
They had another option.
But due to Trump's incompetence and the incompetence of some of the owners, they completely napalmed it with bad decision-making as far as moving the league to the fall, not recognizing the pure economic clout of the NFL, and the league folds in 85, and they have a dispersal draft. Funny story about that. Reggie White, who played for the Memphis Showboats, and we'll get into him probably later in another episode, he was almost drafted by the New York Giants.
Yeah, but got picked up by the Eagles.
Which would have meant Reggie White would have played on a Bill Belichick defense with a coked-out Lawrence Taylor. Dear God.
They would have been murdering people.
Yeah, probably. But
murders.
Murder.
But this is when, so the USFL folds. The players union folds, essentially, not folds, but they decertifies. And that's when I feel like the owners are like, all right, let's see how far we can take this. And that's when Plan B free agency comes in.
Well, yeah, the Plan B free agency comes out of the 87 strike.
The 87 strike, okay.
And the 87 strike is another great example of how pathetic the players union was.
Yes.
Because the only team, and this is a testament to not only Joe Gibbs and Bobby Beathard, but also the wonderful movie called The Replacements, starring Keanu Reeves as Shane Falco, who is the love child of Johnny Utah from Point Break. I will forever go to my grave believing that. They were the only team to not have anybody cross the picket lines, because what you had were general managers like Tex Schramm, threatening stars like Randy White and Tony Dorsett, and that it's not just related to the Cowboys, it's throughout the entire league. Players were crossing the picket lines because they needed money.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of Washington's players almost did it, but they had to have a united front. Gibbs basically told them, like, look, you're going to get what you want, but you're not going to get what you want by crossing this picket line. And, you know, guys like Dexter Manley were pissed off, you know, Pro Bowlers who needed money and things like that, but none of them ever crossed. But because all these players crossed, the strike didn't work. The replacement players didn't play amazing, but they kept the season going to where they played 15 out of 16 games, these teams. But out of it came Plan B free agency, which is a very weird thing, but still a step in the right direction.
Well, it's so weird because what comes out of it, I feel like, is right. But if they had kept it, it essentially makes, if you're a good player, you can't move.
You really can't move.
Not even a great player, just a good player.
Yeah, and you see guys now who are just decent players going on the open market now in the NFL and making bank as far as, contracts. And, they're a weak union, so you only have guaranteed money. It's not like baseball.
Yep.
But to describe Plan B free agency, for those of you who don't know, from 87 to 92, they had this system in place where you had rosters at the time, which were much smaller, so it was 47 guys on a roster. Every year, you could protect 37 of your 47 players
without any restrictions. So you essentially say, "Hey, no other team could come in and even negotiate." And then this other 10 to 13 players, other owners weren't coming in and grabbing them. That was the thing about this, was with this collusion, it wasn't a huge...
And it was mostly the guys who were moving due to Plan B free agency were just lower tier players.
Run of the mill, yes.
Because it was, teams looking for depth at certain positions, going like, okay, this guy's serviceable. We know what he can do. He's left unprotected. We're going to go and get him. I think he can play a little bit more for us.
Yes.
And under this system, teams still had the right of first refusal. And it's much like restricted free agency today. I'm sure we can go into that.
Yeah, we will.
But restricted free agency means like you can match the offer.
Yep.
You can match the offer, but it's 2 years before a contract expires as opposed to, or 1 or 2 in exclusive rights and things like that.
I was going to say there's all kinds of shit now. I know right after Plan B, it was you had to play for 5 years and you could do it a year in, but I think now it's 3 years and you could like they constantly are changing it because there's so much new money being injected.
Yeah, and it's all based on the salary cap and how much revenue these teams are bringing in. It's a weird mathematical formula. I used to have to know it when I used to sports write.
I didn't know that.
Free agency previews. Yeah, so that's 5 years ago. So
I was going to say I looked at because we're researching this stuff and somebody put like, here's the equation for the salary cap because there's a ceiling and a floor now.
Yeah,
and you have to have them both. And we'll get into that.
You know why they have a floor, right?
Not exactly. Which team was it that?
Cincinnati.
Okay, it was Cincinnati.
Another family-owned organization run very incompetently. Mike Brown would never spend any money. Same with Arizona. They kind of factored in. But yeah, you have to spend a certain amount of money. But during this Plan B era, the only player that was protected that, the team didn't want the right of first refusal was Wilbur Marshall, who jumped from Pro Bowl linebacker from the Bears to the Redskins.
Oh, okay.
So he was like the only big name that moved during this time period because owners didn't want to do it. They didn't want to upset the apple cart.
Yeah, they didn't want to turn this boat over that they keep going.
Yeah, that gravy train going.
But because there's no union, we see individual players start suing the NFL. So, like this guy, Freeman McNeil.
Yes, for the Jets, running back.
Who I feel like he would have been lost to history if he didn't, because he's just kind of like a run-of-the-mill running back, right?
No, he was a Pro Bowler. He was he was a really good player. He was like, when the Jets were competitive in the mid-'80s, he was actually drafted before Marcus Allen.
Damn.
In 1981. Or no, 82.
We'll be bringing up later.
Oh, yes. We definitely will. With
one of those free agents that we'll be talking about. But that's interesting because I just saw him a little bit about Freeman. He actually didn't win any damages.
No, he didn't.
But he was the lead plaintiff. I'm going to get that one day. In the suit that ruled that Plan B free agency was illegal.
It is. And it's totally illegal as far as workers' rights and everything like that. I mean, granted, you're not working in a coal mine for 12 hours a day, but by that same token, you're not being compensated for your labor.
Yes.
And in September of 92, September 24th, a U.S. Judge ruled there were players, tight end Keith Jackson, Pro Bowler, Garen Veras, Webster Slaughter, former Aztec, wide receiver for the Browns and Oilers.
Got to bring up that Aztec. I love it.
Hey, man, I hated Webster Slaughter when he played because he would always kill Pittsburgh. But and DJ Dozer, who is a running back most famous on the Penn State team that won the national championship in '86.
All right.
Behind the disturbing defensive genius of a certain defensive coordinator who will be doing life. They they sued and got a restraining order against the NFL. So they were able to be unrestricted free agents for 5 days. And there was also an interesting case in the mid-'80s where you could see the tide wasn't turning, but you could see what it would be. Because in, I believe, 1979, in that draft, Warren Moon had just won a Rose Bowl for Washington. Warren Moon, Hall of Fame quarterback, one of the best quarterbacks of the 1990s. He was so intent on not playing another position. The NFL wanted him to not be a quarterback. They wanted to play him defensive back, wide receiver. Him and his agent, Lee Steinberg, famous, based a lot of the movie Jerry Maguire on, they told every team he wants to play quarterback. Nobody drafted him. And right before the draft, he had signed in Canada with the Edmonton Eskimos, won 5 straight Grey Cups for them. Should not have played in Canada, by the way.
Definitely not.
Absolutely not. But of course, racism. I mean, that's the only way to describe it, for Christ's sake.
You can't really see any other reason why they wouldn't draft him or want him as a quarterback.
He was a scary motherfucker. He was so good.
Yeah.
But anyway, Warren Moon, because no team held his rights, because nobody drafted him, it's not like a Herschel Walker or a Bo Jackson situation where somebody takes a late round flyer and they own your draft rights. You're part of that team. Is that with Moon, when he came back from Canada, nobody owned his rights, and he said, I want to play in the NFL. He started a bidding war around the league of quarterback needy teams.
Yeah.
So he was the first real kind of free agent. And what ended up happening was he wanted to play in Seattle. Obviously, he went to UW, but Houston stepped in with their owner, Bud Adams, oil man. We talked about in the AFL episode, a lot of money.
Yep.
He went to Edmonton and hired his head coach, Hugh Campbell. He was the guy there before Jerry Glanville's insanity in Houston. That's what the
brought
deep
him
pockets.
in.
But he was the first megastar free agent.
To be able to negotiate with multiple teams who wanted a quarterback to come in and be like, who's got the best deal? And like we see with these free agents, it's not always about the money. It's sometimes about who's coaching, who else is on this team. And that's a great example of literally the first free agent.
He honestly really was.
Yeah.
Because even all these USFL players, what ended up happening is either the NFL drafted them later and you had to go there because they had your rights. When the league folded, they just had a dispersal draft, kind of like the ABA for the guys not on those teams.
Yep.
And you were lined up to whoever the hell
picked you up. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's not like they had players that were going undrafted that were big time names, essentially. You know what I mean? Like it was, if you were coming from that folded league, then you were definitely,
you were at the mercy of whatever happened.
Yes.
Steve Young going to Tampa Bay is a great example.
Exactly.
I mean, Reggie White luckily got to play with Buddy Ryan in Philadelphia. But you also had really, really good players in that dispersal draft, like Gary Clark, part of the posse with the Washington Redskins. I mean, you had a lot of really good players. Ricky Sanders, I think, even played in the USFL. I mean,
that's why they had the possibility of being a legitimate league, was they had all these players, and that's what the dispersal draft did, was show that like this was a great league that essentially broke up.
Yeah, and jumping back to 1993, though,
here we go.
After that court case,
that's when the floodgates happened.
That's pretty much when everything happened, because what they decided on March 1st, when the new league year started, it was just this confusing thing, because what ends up happening when they decide finally, okay, we get to have free agency, what the NFL and the owners do is a testament to their power, unlike Major League Baseball, is they have to institute a salary cap.
Yep.
Because what ends up happening is teams like Washington and Houston is another good example. You are crippled by this salary cap because, the rule was, I think, 64% if it's 64% of the cap space that you have. If it's taken up by players, you're going to need to eventually have one.
Yep.
And the owners can't keep teams together. They can't keep all the players together for the same amount of time because there's actual freedom of movement. And it's really, really hurting these teams, but it's the cost of what happens as far as owners still making that extra money. They just can't field the same kind of teams they did before.
They don't have the control over the roster that they once had and these players. And this is what we talk about, like a perfect storm in these sports was. This is right when the TV money came in. So this is right when Fox came in, and they thought the salary cap was originally going to be like 10 million less than it was.
Yeah.
Fox came in and was like, no, we'll pay you like 200 million. And this is in the 90s when it wasn't shit. And
Rupert Murdoch with Fox, that is like the most important TV deal.
Yes.
Because you box CBS out.
Yep.
So it's only Fox doing the NFC games now. And CBS didn't come back and start doing AFC games until I think 98 after NBC's contract expired.
Yep.
So all that TV money because of Rupert Murdoch saying, no, I will televise NFL games. Just tell me the number and
we'll do it.
They got Madden and Summerall from CBS. I mean, they got everybody.
Well, this is what I feel like a lot of these organizations almost kept them afloat in this era of the floor, because I like you were saying with Cincinnati and Arizona, where I bet they would have lost a bunch of money.
Oh yeah.
But because of this new TV deal, they essentially were breaking even or even making money.
Yeah.
Because the fear that these owners had, and you see it with a lot of the deals that originally go out, because some of them are way over, some of them are way under, and some of them are correctly valued. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, it totally is. But the thing is the salary cap, the owners had no idea how it worked.
That too.
Like the Bills GM, Bill Polian, very famous, later GM for the Colts and Panthers and Colts and stuff, won a Super Bowl with them and basically fell ass backwards into Peyton Manning. Very smart guy, though. He had to explain to teams how this structure worked because no one had ever seen this in the NFL.
Yeah.
He had to go around and be like, okay, this is how much you can dedicate. This is like how financially everything is laid out. And people really weren't understanding it. Art Modell, the most hated man in Cleveland, future Ravens owner, basically said, well, I think with the salaries are going to have to eventually pay these players, our first draft choice will be a business school student from Harvard. Not necessarily because he's good, but so he can explain the cap to me.
Oh, yeah. That's great. Because it was confusing for these owners who just would pay whatever. There was no restrictions in what they paid. Obviously, I think a lot of them hated it because they could see that they were going to have to pay more.
Yeah. And there was talk, the original Rooney Rule, the Rooney Rule now is for interviewing minority head coaching and, offensive, defensive coordinator candidates. The original Rooney Rule, though, because obviously the Steelers are a family-owned team at this point, was that to create competitive balance, the top 4 teams could not sign a player unless one of theirs was taken away. So you had to stand pat. And then, it kept going, based on record the previous year and things like that, because there was a legitimate fear among these smaller market and family-owned teams that, man, if we don't pony up the dough, we're just going to be completely crippled by this.
Teams are going to stack, essentially, in bigger markets. And it's really interesting because I want to talk about why free agency came around, because I feel like we glazed over it just a little bit.
Yes, go ahead.
With Reggie White. So the lawsuits came in, and what put the fear in the NFL is Reggie White came in with, I think, 6 or 7 other players with a class action lawsuit.
Yes.
With the ability of any NFL player to sign on.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what class action lawsuits are.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into the law shit because I don't understand it, but it put the fear in the NFL of like, oh, they're not a union anymore, but they can everybody can sue us.
And we'll probably get into this in the next episode. It's Reggie White more than anybody who completely changes the game. Once he signs on,
exactly,
it's not like an anomaly like Warren Moon with just weird special circumstances based on not even monetary things. He just had the lucky advantage of being in Edmonton, sentenced to Edmonton for 5 years.
I love sentenced to Edmonton.
Who the hell wants to live there? Except maybe Grant Fuhrer.
That's it. That's so true. But it's so interesting because without Reggie, I don't think the NFL would have taken it as seriously because other top line NFL players were looking at it like, okay, I'm in. If he's in, I'm in.
Yeah, like they'll toe the company line to keep their endorsements, to keep their jobs. But once the best defensive player in the entire league for close to a decade pre-1993,
Yep.
considering his time in Memphis and then later Philadelphia under Buddy Ryan, is that this guy's the kingmaker. If he says something, you better listen, because whatever he's going to get, the trickle-down effect will reward you greater than you just towing the line.
Yes, definitely. They can see that the future is free agency. These players, essentially,
Yes.
because they've been controlled and held down for so long that they see there's just like, wow, I can make $4 million in a year, which was unheard of.
At that time, there were guys, superstars, who didn't make $4 million on a contract.
Exactly.
And it's a great thing for the league, now, even though you do have a salary cap and owners, will lowball guys and still kind of collude, as you'll see in some instances. But yeah, it's
getting better.
It's getting better. And, the Jackson ruling before and then Reggie White, that's what all creates what the NFL you see today is. And but the owners, they can kind of stick that knife in, because in 93 you have the franchise tag, which allows the owners to use said franchise tag on any player. And you see it in examples like Le'Veon Bell is a good example of that, just refusing to show up.
Yep.
Because it allows the owners to deny free agency to their top player and pay them a salary that's like the average of the top 5 players at that position now. I think that's what it is. I'm not sure if it's changed.
And then if they try to franchise them again, it's 120% of the average. It's something like that where they have to keep adding it.
It keeps increasing.
Yes.
And
if they want to keep them.
If they want to keep them, and the players always still, they can just be like, nope, taking my stuff and going home.
Yeah.
And it's a dangerous situation. A lot of teams will use it on players at positions where they don't have depth, so they can just extend a guy for 1 year, pay him maybe a little bit more than they deserve, but then in the following draft, they go and pick up his replacement, and then they'll get the compensation pick in a couple of years.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like originally it was looked at like, oh, we're going to keep our best player with this, and then people looked at it logically and were like, oh, our best player's not moving this year, let's tag our kicker. You know what I mean? And that's exactly what kind of happens.
And the last thing I wanted to add on that is there have been instances, Sean Gilbert is a good example for I believe it was with the Rams, and then he went to Washington, is if you do decide you can still sign these guys on the franchise tag, but if you end up doing it, you have to give 2 first-round draft picks as compensation.
Yeah, the compensation is insane.
And you have to have the what's it called? The contract done and ready to go. And generally, when the contract is done and ready to go, that is a huge chunk of cap space, and you're giving up draft capital, so almost never happens.
No, the compensation is so. This is why I think the owner set it up so outlandish that you would have to be getting you would have to get like a Lamar Jackson. You know what I mean? You would have to get like literally a piece in your team that you couldn't get otherwise.
You would basically have to have a ready-made team and the cap space, which is almost impossible, because ready-made teams, the cap space, unless you have a rookie quarterback, the only time I think I've ever seen that would be like Seattle from about like 10 years ago, where they would have that and go out and do it. But by that same token,
where they had that underpaid defense,
and Russell Wilson was making like the 29th highest quarterback salary just based on his draft position. But yeah, it almost never happens.
Yes.
And that's a testament to the power of the owners and the collusion and the commissioners basically having their nuts cut off.
And the foresight of the owners, that they saw that the players were going to get some power, but how do we keep some of our control?
Yeah. But that's a history of pre-NFL free agency.
Hey everybody, this is just a stock message at the end of every episode. We hope you enjoyed whatever athlete and or team that episode was about. Just want to say, give us a quick follow on all social media. We have a YouTube channel, the Sports Experience Podcast, and we're on Instagram, DiTolla Dominic, and myself, C. Quinn Comedy. So give us a follow all around. We're always recording right here at Engle Studio. Thank you all very much.